Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is my free 1-hour tutorial for the Fuji X-T2. It's become our favorite little travel camera. If you have a different camera, if you want to send your friends to similar tutorials, visit this URL. We have tutorials for just about every major camera out there. I'm going to cover everything that I think is essential to photography with the X-T2, including things like Wi-Fi. But I will not dig into lots of little special effects and even things like panorama mode. Check the manual for those types of things. So I'm going to stick to the core stuff. If I start covering stuff that you already know, view the description of this video and you'll find a clickable table of contents that will allow you to jump to different parts of the video. So if you're like, Tony, I already know this stuff, just go ahead and skip forward. First, let's go over the physical controls on the camera. I'm going to guess that you know a little bit about photography, but you might not be an expert on this particular camera, so you probably know how to put the memory cards in the side here. It's got 2 memory card slots. Slide them in until they click. I would suggest getting 2 big SD cards, like 128 or 256 gig cards, and putting them both in there, and then configuring the camera to write to both memory card slots. A lot of people think that memory cards never fail nowadays, that they're just very reliable. They are very reliable, but they do fail. And in the course of my career, I've had 3 professional grade memory cards fail, and each time I was using dual card slots. So I didn't lose any shots. But if you're shooting professional shots and you have a client who's paid you to produce some work, you cannot afford to lose a memory card. Therefore, you should be using 2 memory card slots. If you're just shooting casually and it's no big deal if something fails, don't sweat it too much. Quickly, I'll show you how to set up the camera to write to both card slots. Hit the menu button, go down to the wrench icon, then scroll to Save Data Setup. Scroll to the right with the directional pad here. Scroll down to Card Slot Setting. Scroll to the right, and now you can choose either sequential, which will write to the first card until it's full, and then switch to the second card. That's if you just need more space. Backup, which writes to both cards simultaneously using RAW settings or whatever you've configured, or RAW/JPEG, which writes bigger, higher quality RAW files to the main card and lower quality JPEG files to the secondary card. That way, if you do lose the main card, you at least can fall back on the secondary card. For any sort of serious professional work, I would definitely suggest using backup. Now that you have that set, let's continue to look at the rest of the ports on the card. On the bottom of the camera, you slide that back. Then pull back the little yellow slot there. Note that the batteries have a yellow dot there, or an orange dot. This matches up with the orange switch here. So, because it's very easy to put them in backwards or something, just remember the orange lines up together, push it in until it clicks, and then slot that closed. You will need to get extra batteries. I'll talk about the batteries at the end of the video. You see, I'll go over some accessories that I would recommend when you're mounting a lens. First, you'll take off the body cap and the lens cap here. Then you'll line up the red dot there with the red dot on the body. Line that up, twist it clockwise until it clicks, and then wiggle it back and forth just to make sure it's locked in there really good. When you go to release it, there's the button. You just push that in and then twist it counterclockwise until it comes loose. Over on the left side of the camera, you can flip open this door and you'll see a variety of different ports. The descriptions are on the inside of this panel here. The top one is for a microphone. If you're recording video, you can run a standard mic in there, not the type of microphone that you'd use with your smartphone. The other type, the type that only has 2 rings, not the 3-ring microphone. Notice that it does not have a headphone jack. That means you cannot hear the sound as you're recording it. If you want the headphone jack, you have to get this, the vertical grip, which has the headphone jack built into it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The second port here is a USB 3 port that you can use either for tethering the computer or for transferring images off. If you plug it into your computer, it can act like a USB drive. So that way you don't have to take your SD cards out and put them into a memory card reader, so you can. The third port down here is a micro HDMI port. That is used to connect the camera either to a TV for reviewing your pictures on a big screen or to a field monitor. Field monitor is an external recorder that can record, say, 4K video output from the camera. Some professional videographers would use it. And a field monitor is also the only way that you can take advantage of F-Log on this camera. F-Log is a or a high dynamic range style of video recording. The little bottom port there is for a remote, and you probably won't ever need to use a remote on this camera. There's also a remote shutter, like old style screw-in style remote shutter on the main shutter dial here, main shutter button. You probably also won't use one of those unless you happen to have a remote shutter release from like the 60s. It's cool that you can do that, but it's not something really common. This camera is decorated with fantastic amounts of buttons and dials. It's my favorite thing about the camera, specifically these 3 dials on top and the ring on the lens here. The way these work is a little bit different than they were on the X-T1 and other Fuji cameras. The center button here locks it. So when it's depressed, I cannot turn any of these dials. I have to push it once and click it out, and now I can freely turn it. Push it back in to lock it. The reason it locks is that these turn pretty easily, and so if you're putting it in and taking it out of your bag or even just walking around with it, it might brush against your body and change settings. You don't want that, so you lock it down. This one works exactly the same way. The exposure compensation dial here does not have a lock. Instead, the designers just gave it much more tension. So it takes a little more force to turn it, but you don't have to lock and unlock it. That's nice because you often turn it while you have the camera up to your eye. All Fuji lenses have an aperture ring on the lens itself. Now, depending on the lens that you have, you might not see numbers on there like you do on this lens. If you are using the kit lens or a lens like this little pancake lens, you can see it's just kind of an unmarked ring. In order to see the aperture, the f-stop that you're using, you'll have to turn the camera on and look at the display. And we can see down here at the very bottom that it's showing the f-stop that I'm currently at. That's basically how you'll know your current settings. It's really important here, and this is something I call the 3 A's. If you ever feel like you're lost with your camera, if pictures are under or overexposed, if something's going wrong with the settings, and you just forget how camera settings work, or if you're handing the camera to somebody else, go to the 3 A's. You go to automatic for the f-stop. This might be a switch on your kit lens. Go to automatic on the ISO and automatic for the shutter speed. Now your whole exposure triangle is handled automatically, and there's not too much that can go wrong with the camera. One other thing you might check is to make sure this, what they call photometry or something, the metering dial here, make sure it's on this 3rd one with the most stuff inside of it. That's another thing that could throw off your exposure. But if you have a cool camera like this, you should be using those manual settings, and I'll show you a little bit more about which settings to use for this camera as we go forward. Let's back up a little bit and go back over some more of the ports. This camera has a switch on the front here that controls your focus capabilities. So you see this little switch here. On some cameras it's on the lens, but on the Fuji it's right here in the body. S stands for single focus, where the camera will find focus and then lock in. C is for continuous focus, which means the focus isn't as precise, but it will track a moving subject. So it's good for flying birds or sports, and anytime you're tracking something that's moving towards you or away from you. And then M is for manual focus. By default, the camera will ignore manual focus input unless you have it in M mode, but I'll show you how to make it so it will listen to you a little bit later. So most of the time you'll be using this in S mode. So if anything goes wrong, just switch over to that. You have a dial up here right below the shutter speed dial that allows you to control the shutter mode. By default, it'll probably be an S, which is single mode. You'll take one picture by pushing the shutter and then it will stop. I tend to use it in CH mode, continuous high, so it shoots repeatedly. One thing I want you to get into the habit of is turning the camera off, because this camera will burn through batteries really, really quickly. What you want to do is, when you pick up the camera, do this. Just flip the switch right there from off to on. That wakes it up, gets it all ready. And then when you're done taking a picture, even if it's just for 20 seconds, go ahead and just flip it off. Just get into the habit. It fires up really quickly. If you don't do that, I promise at some point you will run yourself out of batteries. You can greatly extend the life just by getting into the habit of that. If you ever pick up your camera and realize you left it on, just like punish yourself a little bit. Just be like, oh, why did I do that? Always turn it off and on. I promise that'll be a lifesaver for you. There are dials on the front and back here. This back dial will by default change the aperture if your lens doesn't have the aperture ring. So just, I prefer using the aperture ring on the lens, on lenses that have it. But if not, you can also change it on the back dial here. In fact, you can use the front dial to change the shutter speed too. but again, I prefer the dials on the top and the bottom. Let's actually talk about taking a picture. By default, it's really simple. Just like any other camera, you'd point it at something, push the shutter button halfway, and then when it locks focus, just click it and it will take a picture for you. That's about all there is to it, but I will say while shooting, you can show yourself different information. You can hit the disp back button here, and the camera will cycle through a bunch of different settings. And this is what it'll show you by default: either a clean screen with no information, a display with the view really small up here, but then a histogram, which will show you the brightness of the image. I cover how to do that, how to read that histogram in chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, or hit it again and we'll get my favorite display, which is a full view of what's going on, as well as some information like your ISO and your shutter speed and your aperture. You can hold the camera up to your eye and it should automatically switch for you so you can use the viewfinder. You can also hit that disp button with the viewfinder up to your eye to switch between a couple of different modes. Either the scene is kind of shrunken down or it's full sized. And I'll show you how to customize those displays in just a little bit. When you go to review a picture, you can hit the play button. Hit the play button here, and it will show you the last picture that you took. And once again, you can hit disp back to kind of cycle through the different information, the histogram here being good to verify that your exposure is okay. One trick, if you're shooting in like a concert or some other dim environment and you don't want your screen to light up the room and disturb everybody, you can hold the camera up to your eye and actually review pictures in the viewfinder. That's not something most DSLR users are accustomed to, but I find it really useful. That's also a great way to review pictures if you're in full sun and the back screen is not bright enough to easily see the pictures. If you want your camera to automatically show you your pictures after you take them, you can turn that on, hit the menu button here, go down to the wrench icon, then go to screen setup, image display, and you can turn that on for different amounts of time. You might just briefly have it flash up on the screen or have it at 1.5 seconds. I actually tend to turn it off on this camera. On an SLR, I have image review on, but with this camera, what you see is what you get. It's showing you the exposure ahead of time, so you generally don't have to chimp, and that image review will burn through batteries much faster, so that's why I generally prefer to have that turned off. I want to introduce you to the quick menu, the Q menu. The back of the camera here has a little Q button here, and it's terribly useful because digging through those menus is mind-numbing, and you will never remember where every menu setting is, but you can get to almost anything by just hitting the Q button here. So now you can see a bunch of different common settings. These are the default layout for the quick menu, but you can actually change the items that are in here. I'm going to leave it at the default for now, and in fact, I'll be referencing the quick menu as we go through the tutorial. I just wanted to show you, hit that Q button. It's incredibly useful. Actually, right now I'll show you how to go in and change it. Hit the menu button and then go down to the wrench icon, button dial settings, then go to edit, where is it? Edit, save, quick menu, and I'll scroll to the right. And so now you can see noise reduction here. That's not something I use often, but I can change that by selecting it, and then I can browse through a variety of different settings that I think might be more useful. Perhaps I actually want to change the sharpness of the image instead. So there, I changed that, and what I recommend doing is not changing the quick menu right away. Instead, spend a couple of months with your camera. You will know which settings that you're digging through the menus to find which things you change most frequently. And at that point, when you find yourself digging through the menus all the time, go in and replace a setting you don't use in the quick menu with something that you do use. You just have to learn to, you have to get some experience with the camera. Turbo mode is incredibly important on this camera. Not as important as on other Fujis, but it's still really useful. This camera by default is in like a low power mode, which helps to not burn up all the batteries. If you put it in turbo mode, everything generally gets faster. By default, they have a shortcut set up on the directional pad here. So you can just push down and it will go from normal mode to boost mode. Boost mode gives it a little more juice. Your screen will be a little bit faster, it'll focus a little bit faster, but like I said, your battery life won't be quite the same. If you want even more power, you can attach the vertical grip here. This actually has a physical dial for normal and boost mode. You can still use the keyboard shortcut or the D-pad, but this is a little more convenient when you have this grip attached. I'll talk about the grip a little bit later. One of the most important things to know is the diopter, because this is a common troubleshooting problem people have. They hold the camera up to their eye and it doesn't seem to be focusing, but maybe live view will work, or everything in the viewfinder here is blurry. The diopter is this little dial right here, and it's basically like dialing in your glasses prescription. So if you are a glasses wearer, you can take off your glasses, hold it up to your eye, and then just twist this dial until everything is as sharp as it can possibly be. Then if you hand it to somebody with a different prescription, everything's going to look blurry and they'll have to do the same thing. If you don't wear glasses, or if you wear contacts, it's not a problem. You don't have to worry about it. But something you should know is that dial can get hit accidentally. So at any point, you might hold up the viewfinder and find it all blurry. Just repeat that process. Hold it up to your eye and twist that diopter until everything is nice and sharp. I should also mention, on the right side of the viewfinder is this view mode button here. And this can also get accidentally pressed, making it really confusing, because by default, the camera will switch between the rear display and the viewfinder up here when you put your eye up to it. If you don't want that behavior, or if it stops doing it, hit this view mode button here, and it will switch between back display, or automatically switching, the viewfinder only, and then the LCD only. You can see right now it's LCD only. So I'll hit that one more time until it says eye sensor. Let's talk about how to customize the display. There's just about every aspect of this camera can be customized. So hit the menu button here, go down to the wrench icon. I suggest just working along with me, because you can just watch this, but you're going to learn it a lot better if your own hands actually do it, because you have to actually, there's some muscle memory here you have to teach. Scroll over to screen setup, then go down to display custom setting here. So push that, and now we see a list of different information that we can display, whether we're using live view or the viewfinder here. And so, for me, one thing I really like to see is the electronic level. So I'll select that. I also really like to see the histogram, so I'll select that. I don't care about photometry or flash. So now I've customized the display a little bit. I'll hit the back button here and go into the shooting. So now you can see I can actually see the histogram while I'm shooting. Terribly useful for me. Again, get to know your camera, figure out how you use it, the information that you want, and then go in and customize it to your own needs. Just about every camera on the planet has a mode dial that switches between aperture priority, shutter priority, manual mode, program mode. This X-T1 does not. It has a completely different control paradigm, which in my opinion is vastly, vastly superior. But if you read my book, Stunning Digital Photography, or if you're just talking to other people, they'll bring up things like shutter priority, manual mode, aperture priority. So I want to show you how to control the camera in those terms. Aperture priority allows the camera to set the shutter speed automatically while you control the f-stop. The f-stop is the opening in the lens. Small f-stop numbers like f2 have a really big opening. Higher f-stop numbers like f32 have a really small opening. And if you're not familiar with what f-stop does, a high f-stop number blurs the background, isolating the subject from the background. A high f-stop number brings the background into focus, making it sharp. Remember, high f-stop number, high background sharpness. This changes photographically the image. This high f-stop number provides more context, while a low f-stop number provides more contrast, more background separation. So if you want to understand that better, you can visit this URL right here, sdp.io/f-stop. But I'll show you how to create an aperture priority mode on the X-T1. You'll set the shutter speed to A, automatic. This is this style here. Set that to A. You might also set your ISO to automatic. If you have a lens with the aperture numbers marked on the lens, just turn the dial to the aperture that you want to use. You can see it stops in 1/3 stop increments. f4, letting in half the light of f2.8. If you want the camera to take control of the aperture, switch over to the A there. I'll change lenses to a lens that does not have the f-stop numbers marked on it, just to show you the kind of behavior that you get out of that. So with this lens, you can control the aperture ring on the lens itself. Well, this lens doesn't actually have an aperture ring, but you're going to look at the back screen to see what the f-stop is here. And you're going to be moving the front dial here to change the f-stop number. So as I scroll left, you can see it's at f2.8 now. And as I scroll to the right, it's at f4. And if it isn't showing that, you might just have to move it a little bit to get it to actually take control, because it might still be in automatic mode. I find this to be a real nuisance with this camera. I can't really stand to use lenses that don't have the f-stop numbers marked. To each their own. If you're the type who leaves it in automatic mode, it's not going to be a problem, but I tend to always control my aperture, and I don't like having to turn the camera on and look at the back screen and then change it like that. I find that to be a little cumbersome. What I like about this camera is that I can move analog physical dials. So for that reason, I make a point of choosing the Fuji lenses that have the numbers marked on the aperture ring. If you're like me, you might change lenses just to be able to use those physical controls. It's something to think about. As an upgrade to the kit lens, I really like the 16 to 55 f2.8. It's outrageously expensive, but it provides this physical ring here, and that makes all the difference to me. Something that's useful is, in this mode, you can see this A in a block here. That's the camera telling you it's in aperture priority mode. So even though you can't just directly select that mode, you always just directly change the f-stop, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The camera is still kind of translating that into old school DSLR terms. Aperture priority is the mode I use most, and it's the mode that you'll use when you want creative control over how much background blur there is for things like portraiture or even just general shooting. If you're shooting any kind of action where you might want to freeze motion, you'll want to use shutter priority mode, where you let the camera automatically determine the aperture and you specify the shutter speed by changing the shutter speed dial here. So I'll twist this dial on the lens over to A. Might be a switch on your lens. That means the camera is now setting the aperture automatically. Then I'll unlock the shutter speed dial here and turn it to something different, like 1/250th. The shutter speed dial goes from 1/8000th of a second, the maximum mechanical shutter speed, all the way to 1 second. If you want to go above 1 second, if you want a 2-second exposure, a 10-second exposure, a 30-second exposure, switch it over to T. Now, if I pull up the display back here, now we can control the shutter speed by using the back dial here. And so I can go all the way up, scrolling to the left. If it shows the quote mark there, that means it's a number of seconds and not a fraction of a second. So I can go to 4 seconds, all the way up to a full 30 seconds here. So that's how you get to those longer shutter speeds. If you want a faster shutter speed, you can do that too. And you'll do it the same way by selecting T here and then scrolling to the right, and you'll see that'll get you to 1/8000th of a second with the default settings. But this camera has a hidden feature that will enable faster shutter speeds. Show you how to do that. Hit the menu button here, then go to the camera icon and go to shutter type. Right now it says MS, which is mechanical shutter. That's that clanking that you hear when you take a picture. If you switch over to the electronic shutter, you can see at the bottom here, it says 1/32,000th of a second up to 30 seconds. So I'll select the electronic shutter instead. And now I can scroll to the right a little bit further and actually get myself up to 1/32,000th of a second. Again, you want to select T here on the top dial to do that. So why does the camera have the mechanical shutter set as the default and not the electronic shutter, even though the electronic shutter can be faster? The mechanical shutter eliminates what's called rolling shutter, where you might see a little bit of a slant if you're taking a picture of a fast-moving subject, or maybe you're photographing something close up out a car window while you're driving. You'll see like telephone poles, instead of being vertical, they'll be slanted like that. The mechanical shutter eliminates rolling shutter. So if you're shooting high-speed action, you'd probably want to be using the mechanical shutter, except you can't above 1/8000th of a second. It's really not that much of a problem. Either way, it's not that much of a problem. I personally keep the electronic shutter on because I like it to be silent. That's more important to me than eliminating any kind of rolling shutter. With the shutter speed set on the top dial here, I can now fine tune it with the back dial. So you'll notice that the shutter speed dial jumps and stops. It goes from 1/60th, 1/125th, 1/250th. It's doubling. What if you want something between 1/250th and 1/125th? You'll put it on the closest number, and then you can fine tune it with the back dial here. So now it's at 1/250th. I can click it left and get to 1/260th or 1/200th, and go to 1/320th or 1/400th. You can't just go indefinitely. You can only go like plus or minus 2/3 of a stop. If you want to go beyond that, you'll just have to click the top dial and then fine tune it a little bit. That would be a huge pain if you always cared about 1/3 stop increments. I personally don't care that much about 1/3 stop shutter increments. I'm usually just happy picking a full stop. If that's not you, then this whole X-T1 control paradigm is going to seem like a real nuisance, the fact that you have to now control 2 different dials, but usually it's good enough for me. For more information about which shutter speed you should use, visit this link here, sdp.io/settings. To give you an example of a time when changing the shutter speed is useful, I brought my daughter, well, this was a long time ago, she was much younger, on one of those merry-go-rounds, and I'm sitting opposite her, so we're both spinning at the same pace, but you can see in this left picture at 1/8, the background is completely blurred. She's moving at the same speed as me, so she's still. At 1/30th, the background is much less blurred. It's much sharper because I'm freezing the motion. The shutter speed is much faster. And at 1/125th of a second, a much faster shutter speed, the background seems completely frozen, even though we're moving at the same pace. It's just the shutter wasn't open long enough to actually show that blur. So that's the power of shutter speed. If you want to take full manual control of your camera, all you have to do is set the aperture and set the shutter speed separately. So just put both of them in anything but A. And you can do the same for your ISO over here. And that's basically manual mode. You can see the camera will show you manual mode here anytime you change the shutter speed and aperture manually. I want to just quickly share tutorials covering specific types of photography that you might find helpful. Night photography, visit this URL here. For information on landscape photography, visit this URL. These are all free tutorials. Wildlife photography is covered here. And if you want more information on shooting in manual mode, including how to reliably set your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO so you get a good exposure, visit this URL here. I should also say, if you want to shoot sports with this camera, there are a couple of things you can do to really optimize your settings. The first thing you're going to do is switch the focusing dial here over to C for continuous. That will cause the camera to continuously focus. You're also going to want to take control of your shutter speed. For when I shoot my kid's soccer game, she's a 12-year-old girl, 1/250th is usually about the right speed. There's no right answer for what your shutter speed should be, but 1/250th is usually enough to freeze most of the action, but still show just a little bit of movement in the ball. Depending on the sport, your distance to the subject, the lens you're using, you might just have to experiment a little bit to find the right shutter speed for that. If I were shooting high school sports, I'd be at 1/500th. Another setting that you might want to change is the actual focusing mode, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But for the time being, the way I would do that is I'd hit the Q button here, and I'd scroll over to the AF mode. And for sports, you know, people have different takes on this, but my take is I like to use the single small focusing point here, just like that. And then I move it around with this thumbstick here. So with that, I would move it like this. To put it on my subject. You'll also want to make sure that you're in boost mode by pushing down here, boost mode, and that vertical grip, once again, that vertical grip's really, really helps. If you're shooting in a studio environment, of course you'll be in manual mode. Well, when I say a studio environment, I mean when you're using external lights. So you might have a flash trigger here that's communicating to manual lights. You'll have to change the settings so that the camera doesn't try to preview the exposure, because of course, if you're relying on studio lights as your main lights, the camera at whatever settings that you dial into it, the whole scene is going to be too dark. So the first thing that you'll do is you'll go into the menu here. You'll go down to the wrench icon, go down to screen setup, then choose preview exposure / white balance in manual mode, and select it. And by default, it's going to be preview exposure and white balance. That's fantastic for regular shooting because you can look through the viewfinder and see the exact shot you're going to get, including whether it's under or overexposed. But in a studio where you're relying on flashes and the camera can't communicate with those flashes, the camera's going to think the scene is too dark, So you have to go in and turn off this previewing. And that way, when you hold the camera up to your eye, it's just going to kind of always make the scene a reasonable exposure. Even if it's super bright or even if it's super dark, it'll automatically make it so you can see the scene, even though it doesn't reflect the picture. Like if I zoom in here and I take this picture, when I play it back, you can see the picture I took doesn't look anything like what was on the screen. That's because I turned off that preview. Again, you only need that when you're connecting to studio lights. So I'm going to go back in and turn that off just for my own purposes. Set it back to preview exposure white balance. That's more useful. Also, when you're shooting in the studio, the sync speed on this camera is 1/250th. So set that to your shutter speed. You can see it's marked there with an X because for some reason, X is the universal symbol for sync speed. So 1/250th, and then usually a base ISO of ISO 200, and then whatever aperture you need to get the proper exposure. This camera has an L there for low, which is actually ISO 100, but if you're shooting raw, you're gonna get the best image quality at ISO 200. Adapted lenses. You can put just about any DSLR lens on this camera because it's a mirrorless camera. If you want to put your Canon or Nikon lenses on there, you can do that. You're not gonna have autofocus. And if the lens doesn't have an aperture ring on it, you might not be able to control the f-stop like you wouldn't be able to with most Canon lenses. But you can do it. You can just look up the adapter you might need, like Canon to Fuji X-mount adapter. If you do that, you will have to turn on a mode on the camera so that it will allow you to shoot without communicating with the lens, because the camera won't have electronic communications to the lens probably. So hit the menu button, go to the wrench icon here, go to button/dial setting, and then go to shoot without a lens attached. Shoot without lens, there, and turn that on. You can actually just turn that on all the time and leave it on. It's not a problem if it's turned on under normal circumstances, because presumably you'll know whether or not you've attached a lens, and you're probably not going to try to shoot without a lens. You'll notice. Now take a quick minute and I'll plug some books that I've written. The #1 photography book in the world is Stunning Digital Photography. The paperback is under 20 bucks. The ebook itself is only 10 bucks. And it's not just a book. If you think books suck, this comes with over 14 hours of video. For best results, read the book, watch the videos as you go through it, and that will really teach your brain in different ways all the artistic aspects of photography, things like mood, expression, lighting. It's not all just about figuring out the buttons and dials on your camera. There's a lot more to actually getting beautiful photos. You can also just watch the videos if you're not the type who's into books, and it helps to support us to make these free videos. I also have books on Photoshop, Lightroom, and a book that covers everything about buying camera gear in case you want to figure out what lenses, flashes, studio lights, light modifiers, reflectors, all that stuff. I reveal every mystery of camera gear in this book, and I can save you thousands of dollars. To buy my books, you can go to Amazon and just search for Tony Northrup or the names of any of these books. You can also go directly to our store, sdp.io/store, where we tend to have the best prices, and we also ship worldwide. Let's go on and talk about the different shutter modes on this camera. By default, the camera will probably be set to S. This dial here, below the ISO dial, this controls your shutter mode. So S here is single shutter. And when I take a picture, even if I hold the shutter down, it only takes one picture. CL is continuous low speed shutter. So if I hold the shutter down, it will keep taking pictures. CH is continuous high-speed shutter, where it takes pictures faster. Everything is dark because I had the shutter speed set incorrectly. There we go. For most of my shooting, I will shoot in CH. Even if it's portraits, it doesn't hurt to bang off a couple of shots just to improve the chances that you get a shot with everybody's eyes open and with no weird expressions going on. You can always delete pictures. It doesn't hurt to have too many. It's not a film camera. You can change the rate of both the continuous high and the continuous low in case one is too fast or too slow for you. Hit the menu button here. Under the camera icon, go to drive setting and scroll to the right. And now you can see separate settings for CH high speed burst and CL low speed burst. Low speed burst is 5 frames a second by default. I like that, but you could slow it down. CH is 8 frames by default, but you could go all the way up to 14 frames a second. 14 frames a second is great for sports. I'll say you will not see a live display when you're shooting at 14 frames a second. When you take pictures, instead you'll see the picture you just took. So there'll be more delay when you're shooting at 14 frames a second and using the viewfinder. And that can make sports a little more difficult to shoot. It's still what I use for shooting sports, 14 frames a second on this camera, because I get the most options, and generally I shoot in short bursts, so I don't fall that far behind the action. But if you want a more DSLR-like experience, use the CL low speed burst at 5 frames a second, and it will actually show you a live view through the lens between each frame. Now, I have the electronic shutter turned on in the camera, and that's why I was able to select 14 frames a second. If you don't see that option, if I hit the menu option here and I go into drive setting again, and I go to CH high speed burst, you can see those options are grayed out. If that's what you're seeing, it's because you have the camera set to mechanical shutter. So I'll hit back here and go to the camera icon and then shutter type and switch from mechanical shutter over to electronic shutter. And now when I go up into drive setting, I can select a higher speed burst, silent shutter. For something like street photography, or if you're shooting a wedding in a church and you don't want to disturb people, or maybe you're shooting like a jazz concert where the volume levels are pretty low and you're in an auditorium and you don't want that mechanical shutter just like blasting everybody, you might want to turn on silent shutter. I love a silent shutter on a camera, even for sports and stuff. I turn on the silent shutter, so when I'm on the sideline, like all the parents aren't looking at me as my camera's banging away 14 frames a second. Go into the menu here, and you want to make sure the shutter type is set to ES. That's electronic shutter. Then you just need to go down to the sound setup. So I'm going to the wrench icon here. Second item down is sound setup. I'll scroll to the right. And here we go. Shutter sound. We're going to scroll to the right here. Nope. Shutter volume. We're going to scroll to the right here and then turn it off. So that's all you have to do. As long as you're in electronic shutter mode, volume off. Now you can see I'm taking pictures and not making a sound. Fantastic. Thank you, Fuji, for putting that incredibly useful feature in there. The self timer. If you want to take a picture of your family, you put your camera on the tripod, you hit the shutter, and then you run around and put your arm around your family. Or if you have the camera on a tripod and you want to get the steadiest shot possible by eliminating any camera shake from you pushing the shutter button, the self timer is the way to do this. To turn on the self timer, hit the Q button here. And in the lower right corner by default, you'll see you can select from 2-second self timer or 10-second self timer. The 2-second self timer is the right choice when you want to eliminate camera shake and you're on a shutter. The 10-second self timer is the right choice when you need time to actually run and put your arm behind your family. So you can see if I set it to 2 seconds there, now when I push the shutter button, this blinks a little bit, it beeps, and then actually takes the picture. You didn't hear the shutter because I still have it set to a silent shutter. Let's talk about how to use the interval timer. I find the interval timer is a better technique for when I do need to take a selfie with my family, because I'll set the camera to actually take 10, 20 pictures, and then I can pick the best of those. So I don't have to keep running back to the camera to push the shutter button. Interval timers are also a great way to make star trails or to do a time lapse. So let's talk about how to turn that self timer on. I'll hit the menu button. I'll go to the camera icon here and then down to interval timer shooting. I'll scroll to the right. And now I need to select the interval and the number of shots. So you can see by default, it's showing me it's going to take a picture, one picture after 1 minute. And let's set this to a faster speed, like one picture every 4 seconds. That's a pretty good pace if you want to take pictures of your family. So what we'll do is we'll set it to like 20 shots and set the waiting time. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0 hours and 0 minutes. So it'll start shooting as soon as I start. Then I'll miss a couple of shots while I run and put my arm around my family, but that's good enough. You can see it labels down here, OK, starts it, or you can hit the back button to cancel it. So I'll hit OK. And you can see it's counting down 4 seconds. Click. I have silent shutter, so I'm making clicking sounds like click. And it's taking that picture every 4 seconds. If you wanted to stop early, just hit the OK button and you'll cancel it. Interval timer, terribly, terribly useful. Let's talk about the different focusing modes. This camera has greatly improved focusing over other Fuji cameras that we've tested. And so you don't have to sweat the focusing modes too much. It used to be you put a lot of energy into optimizing the focusing mode that you chose for different scenes, but I find just about every focusing mode works really well. Do want to cover the different focusing modes though. Hit the Q button here, and the second option up here is the AF mode. And as I scroll between this, you can see I'm selecting basically different sizes for the focusing. This is group AF. When I select this, I'll select that and hit the OK button. The camera will focus anywhere in the frame. Basically, it will focus whatever it thinks is the most important part of the frame or whatever it grabs focus on first. You're trusting the camera to decide where to focus. That's never my preference, unless I'm shooting flying birds against a blue sky. That's okay. But in every other scenario, I want to actually pick where I want the camera to focus. The second setting here with the little box, a smaller box, if I select that, you can see as I scroll around with the thumbstick here, the area it's focusing is pretty large, and it will even move around within that group. And to me, this is really never precise enough. That's not precise enough to focus on somebody's eye or to pick out one person on the sports team, so it wouldn't focus on something else. I always want it to be a little more precise. Fortunately, you can do that with this camera. So for that, I scroll over and I pick the smallest point here. And that's my preference. So now I'm on this fairly small focusing point, and I can control exactly where I want it to focus. If you see this array of dots when you're scrolling around, those are the phase detect focusing points, and those will give you the most performance. If you scroll outside those dots, you can still focus, but now you're relying on contrast-based focusing, and so it'll be just as precise, but it can be slower in different scenarios. Depending on the conditions, whether it's a still subject or a moving subject, you might not have any problem with that, just so you know what the deal is with that. With the single focus point selected, you can also change the size of that focusing point. A bigger focusing point focuses faster, but a small focusing point is more precise. So a big focusing point like that size might, if you try to focus on somebody's eye, it might focus on their forehead or their nose instead because it's so big. You might want to use a smaller focusing point. To change that, hit the menu button here, go to AF+MF here, find focus area, and then scroll to the right. And now you can move the point around and see all the different points, but by changing the back dial here, you can switch between different focusing point sizes. So for me, if I'm doing portraiture and I'm not using eye detect, I'll have the smallest focusing point selected because I find it to be the most precise. Now, if you've used previous Fuji cameras, you'll know that the smaller the focusing point, the less reliable the focusing can be. And in fact, your odds of hunting with a small focusing point are much better than with a big focusing point. But in my experience with this camera, even in low light conditions, the small focusing point works really reliably. So I don't feel like you have to hesitate too much from using that small focusing point. For more information about whether to choose group or single AF and information about focusing in general, visit this URL here. Now let's talk about face and eye detection. Because it's a mirrorless camera with lots of intelligence, it can actually figure out where faces are in the frame and even figure out what the nearest eye is and lock focus on that, because that's traditional when you're doing portraiture. That option might not be turned on depending on your settings though. To turn on face and eye detection, hit the Q button here. And by default, it's the bottom row, the second from the right. So you can scroll to that and then use the back dial to switch between the different modes. You might not see all these options. I'll discuss that in just a little bit. But off means there is no face or eye detection going on. That actually improves the overall focusing performance, because when you select face and eye detection, it takes a little bit of the camera's attention away from just focusing on whatever it can find. In other words, when you don't need face and eye detection, it's best to turn it off. Scroll to the right. This is face detection, the head with brackets around it. This means it'll focus anywhere on the face, and that's okay for general photography. If you're shooting portraiture with something like the 56mm f1.2 or the 50-140 f1.8, where you're really going to blur the background, you want to be sure you use eye detection instead. Keep scrolling to the right. The eye with the brackets around it means the camera is configured to find the closest eye, because in portraiture you typically focus on the nearest eye. It will seek it out in the frame, and it's not 100% reliable. In fact, we found that it works maybe 2/3 of the time. So it will find and focus on an eye often, At other times, though, it will leave you a little bit frustrated as it misses focus. So for that reason, I'm hoping a firmware update in the future will change this. Do check for firmware updates for your camera and apply them. In the meantime, I haven't been using eye detection. I've really been using a small focusing point and putting it on the eye, just kind of doing it the old DSLR way. I hope that gets better in the future. If you continue to scroll, you'll see options for focusing on the left eye or the right eye, whatever it finds, or you can again turn it off. Now, if you're not seeing all of those options, it's because it's dependent on your focusing mode and your shooting mode. If I change the focusing from single mode over to continuous mode, you can see now I'm able to choose between face detection and off, but I don't get to select any eye detection. That's because continuous focusing steals too much of the camera's attention away from finding eyes. In other words, it just doesn't have the processing power to pick an eye out from the frame. If I switch over to continuous high mode with continuous focusing, as you might be for sports, it will turn off face and eye detection completely. That's generally pretty good, actually, because if you're shooting sports, you're probably going to switch the camera into continuous focusing and continuous shutter, and you wouldn't want face detection working. It would actually slow down focusing. So it's good that Fuji has done that for us. Another focusing option you might be interested in is pre-AF. Now, by default, the camera starts focusing when you have to press the shutter button or when you push like the AFL button here. But you can have it focus the entire time the camera is turned on and not in a sleep mode. That way, if you're not have to pressing the shutter, it will be trying to find focus for you, and it might speed up focusing a little bit. I leave this option turned off because it burns through extra batteries, and I'm just in the habit of have to pressing the shutter button even before I might get it to my eye, so it's already starting to focus. If you want to turn that on, like I said, I don't find it useful, but I'll show you where it is. Hit the menu button, go to AF+MF, go over to pre-AF, and then you can turn it on there. Again, I don't like that, so I'm going to turn it off. The focus assist light blasts light from this little lamp here, a white light, that tries to illuminate the subject to make focusing easier in dim environments. I find the camera does well without it, and I hate that lamp, especially for something like street photography. It's the opposite of discreet. It announces to everybody you're taking a picture. It can blind your subjects. It draws a huge amount of attention to you. I hate all those things. Also, most of the time, the lamp is completely blocked by the hood on my lens, so it's not helping anyway, and it's not necessary. Turn that off by hitting the menu button, going to AF+MF here, and then going down to AF Illuminator. I'll scroll to the right and turn that off. Now let's talk about AF+MF mode. By default, when you're in autofocus mode, like single focus or continuous focus here, you can't just grab the focusing ring and start manually focusing. It will just ignore your input. That can be nice, so you don't accidentally hit that ring. If you want to be able to manually focus while autofocusing, you can turn that on. Hit the menu button, go to the AF+MF setting here, and then scroll down to the second page, go to AF+MF, hit that and turn it on. And now what you can see is, it'll do its best to autofocus, and then I can grab that focusing ring and focus it. It's only going to work while you have the shutter button pressed halfway. If you let off the shutter button, it will ignore your manual focusing input. But you can see the focusing scale here on the bottom is showing the distance that I've focused at. If you're using manual focus, you might also enjoy using MF Assist. MF Assist just does one of a couple of different things, like magnify the screen to make focusing easier. So I'll switch this switch over to manual focus mode. And when I do that, you can see it gives me a little focus check indicator. I'll do it again so you can see the message pop up. See, it says focus check there, and what it's doing is it's showing this back dial here. So by default, if I push that back dial, it will zoom in for me, and that just makes the focusing easier. You'll see the same thing in your electronic viewfinder. So that helps me really nail the focus, and I can push it again to zoom back out. Even if you're zoomed in and you take the picture, it's going to take the entire scene. It's just zooming in to help you focus it. I like that default option the best for manual focus assist, but you have other choices too. I'll hit the menu button here, go up to AF+MF, go to MF Assist, and you can select between standard, which zooms in, digital split image, or focus peaking. So I'll select the digital split image to show you what that looks like. We'll do it in color. And so now you can kind of see this cool display there. Okay, so there you go. If you look at the way assist is written. When it's way out of focus, you can see that the two sections don't line up as I manually focus. The point when they line up is when it's going to be in focus. And why would you want to use this? Probably never. Probably never. If you've ever used an old SLR, for example, with a split prism viewfinder, that will seem familiar to you, and maybe you want that kind of experience, but I don't find it's particularly precise or useful. I just wanted to show you where it was. You can greatly tune the focusing behavior of the camera, but I'll say when I've experimented with tuning the focusing behavior, it only makes it worse. I find the default settings are actually pretty good for a variety of different situations. I will show you where they are in case you want to get into it yourself. Hit the menu button, and then you can go to AFC custom settings. This is good for sports. It's only going to work when you have the shutter in continuous mode. And now you can switch between multi-purpose, ignoring obstacles, optimizing for rapidly accelerating and decelerating subjects. They have a little picture here. They make it pretty self-explanatory. So you can scroll between these options, or you can even customize it with these 3 different parameters to optimize it for the specific type of shooting that you're doing. Some of you are gear nuts, and you're going to love the ability to tune that kind of stuff. Like I said, for me, the defaults tend to work best for a variety of different situations. Let's talk a little bit about ISO. ISO, not an acronym. It's not ISO. If you don't believe me, or you just want to learn more about ISO, visit this URL here. ISO controls basically the sensitivity of your camera sensor. So a high ISO will properly expose pictures in really dim environments. A low ISO is what you would use in bright sunlight. The camera always produces the cleanest images when it has plenty of light. So when you're using a low ISO in bright sunlight, you'll have nice, clean images. And if you use a high ISO, like ISO 6400, in dim light, you're going to get noisy images with little speckles of red, blue, and green, especially in the shadowy areas. You don't have to worry about ISO. You can always just take this ISO dial here, dial it over to A, and just lock it in. Let the camera pick the ISO for you. It has a fantastic metering system. It should be fine. If you do decide to take control of it, if you've learned what ISO is, maybe you read chapter 4 in Stunning Digital Photography, unlock it, twist it to where you want it, and you should be good. Now, ISO 200 is the base ISO of this camera. So that's going to generally give you the cleanest images. L here by default is set to ISO 100. It's actually overexposing an image at ISO 200. It's kind of doing a fake ISO 100. So the image isn't going to be overexposed, but you are going to be losing a stop of dynamic range. If you're shooting JPEG, that won't really matter too much for you. If you're shooting RAW, you might as well just shoot at ISO 200 and raise the exposure or lower the exposure in post. Just be sure you don't clip the highlights or anything like that. You can see you can adjust the ISO here in 1/3 stops. It also goes all the way up to ISO 12,800, which should be plenty for even very dark environments. But you also have H, which is basically higher than that. And you can control exactly what H means from the menus. I'll hit the menu button, go down to the wrench icon, and then I'll go to button dial setting, scroll to the right, and I'll go to ISO dial setting H, and I'll select that. And you can see you can choose between 25,600 or 51,200. These are both virtual ISOs. They're not real ISOs. So all the camera is doing is it's taking a picture at ISO 12,800, underexposing it, and then brightening it a stop. So you're going to get really noisy images either way. But if you edit your pictures in Lightroom or something, you can just shoot at ISO 25,600, just leave it at the default, and then raise your exposure in Lightroom or whatever app you use, and you will pretty much get the exact same image. So for that reason, I pretty much just leave it at ISO 25,600. I also want to talk about how to customize the auto ISO settings. So when you have the camera in A for ISO here, it will by default only go up to ISO 800, which is a weird default. After all, why would you not want to use the higher ISOs if it means properly exposing the image? There's no good reason not to. To change that, hit the menu button here, then go to the camera icon, scroll to the right, and go to ISO auto setting. So I'll scroll to the right here, and I can choose between Auto 1, Auto 2, and Auto 3. Auto 1 maxes out at ISO 800, Auto 2 maxes at ISO 1600, and Auto 3 maxes at ISO 3200. If I scroll to the right again, I can actually change these. So the default sensitivity is ISO 200 in Auto 3. I can raise the auto ISO maximum speed up even higher. So I'm going to set that to ISO 12,800 because if I'm in a dark environment where I actually need that, I'm going to want to go ahead and use it. But it has a minimum shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, and that's actually pretty fast because I can definitely handhold pictures at 1/30th of a second and get good results. Depending on the lens I'm using, I can even go slower. If it has image stabilization, like the kit lens does, I could shoot at 1/10 of a second and get sharp pictures. But for my sake, for my own purposes, I'm going to drop that down to 1/30th of a second. So now, when I am using automatic settings on the camera, it's going to be at a non-default setting. It will allow me to go all the way up to 12,800 as long as it doesn't drop below 1/30th of a second. 1/60th is good for people with shaky hands, beginners, that kind of thing. But if you have a steady hand and image stabilization, definitely go lower with that. Exposure compensation controls how bright or dark your image is when you're using auto exposure. So I have auto exposure on here. You don't, as long as the ISO, the shutter speed, or the aperture, just one of those three is set to automatic, you're using auto exposure and exposure compensation will work. Let's open that up to f2.8. This is your exposure compensation dial. And when it's at 0, you're going to trust the camera to get the correct exposure. If the camera is giving you an exposure that's too dark, you'll turn this up to 1, and it will be twice as bright, basically. So you can see, as I'm moving the dial up and down, -3 makes it darker, +3 makes it much brighter. What you'll do when you're shooting is, maybe you'll be using the viewfinder. If the scene looks dark to you, you have that histogram turned on, and you see that the right third of the histogram here isn't illuminated, you're just going to add some exposure compensation until it's nice and bright, but you aren't blowing out the highlights. That's kind of an ideal exposure. That was a very brief description of exposure compensation. For a detailed description, grab my book, Stunning Digital Photography. Chapter 4 tells you everything you need to know about how to use exposure compensation to get the cleanest images possible and to properly expose them. Or here's a free video, sdp.io/ec. Just watch that, it's free. Bracketing. Bracketing takes pictures at multiple different exposures. So it'll take a picture at what it thinks is the correct exposure, and then maybe at -1 stop, and then at +1 stop. This allows you to pick the best exposure later when you're back at your computer. Just for those times when you're unsure about the exposure. Bracketing is also useful when you want to blend multiple images together. Maybe you're doing HDR processing, high dynamic range processing. There's a chapter in that on STP. Just turn on bracketing. There's a option for it right here on the shutter speed dial. BKT, the second from the left. So I'll select that, and now when I take a picture, you can see it's actually taking 3 pictures for me. And if I hit the play button, I can scroll through those 3 pictures and you can see proper exposure, overexposed, underexposed. Those are really, really slight differences, right? That's because by default, the camera doesn't bracket at a very wide range compared to other cameras. You can change how much of a jump there is between those 3 exposures. To change the bracketing, there's actually a shortcut button configured by default. This button up here, push that, and you'll get the bracket option here. And you can see by default, it brackets at 1/3 of a stop, which is like nothing. You can't even hardly tell the difference between 1/3 of a stop. I always set it to +2. So I'll set that to +2. If you've changed that shortcut, I'll show you how to get to it from the menus. Hit the menu button, go to the camera icon, go to drive setting, and then BKT settings, scroll to the right. And so now you can see you want the AE bracket, set it to ±2. The other ones you can pretty much ignore. So now when I take 3 pictures, I'll play those back. You can see properly exposed, overexposed by 2 stops, underexposed by 2 stops. That's how you use bracketing. Check chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography covers how to use HDR. It's also really useful for landscape photography. Now let's talk about how to use the Wi-Fi app. I'm gonna warn you ahead of time, this never goes well. Wi-Fi apps are pretty intense and unreliable, but they can allow you to transfer pictures from your camera to your smartphone. That way, if you're traveling around, you don't have to take out the SD card and put it in your laptop and load it up. You just want to share a vacation picture quickly, you can do that. So it's in a really bizarre place. You have to turn on the communications first. So I'll hit the menu button here. I will go under the camera icon and then scroll down to wireless communication. I'll scroll to the right. And so now you can see some instructions. It says start up Fujifilm app for digital camera and select the function. And then this is like the name of the camera. And this blinking green thing means it's in Wi-Fi mode. So what we're going to do now is turn on our phone. If you don't have the app installed, search your app store for Fujifilm camera remote. This is it here. So I'll open that up. Make sure our camera's still awake. Okay, it's awake and it's broadcasting. And it tells you here to select the wireless communication function from the camera. So I'll hit connect. So now they're searching for each other. Now I can choose from remote control, browsing the camera, geotagging, which will collect GPS data here and then transfer it to the phone, or to the camera, and then receiving pictures. So if you want to transfer pictures, you'll hit receive. If you're having problems connecting, one thing you want to do is make sure your phone is connected to your camera's Wi-Fi network. So you can see mine is connected to the Fuji here. That will disconnect your phone from the internet until you disconnect that Wi-Fi, because your phone's going to try to get to the internet through the camera, even though the camera's not connected to the internet. So we'll try this again. Browse camera. If you do get connected and you select an option like browse camera, you'll see this, connect OK. I'll click OK here. It's just kind of a security thing. So now you can see camera's talking to the phone, it's connecting, and I'm browsing the pictures on the camera here. So what I can do is I can select one like that and then import it. And it's going to import the entire picture in. Okay, it's saved. Now what I can do is I can hit the share button. And that disconnects Wi-Fi. So if I want to share another picture, I have to reconnect to the camera and do all that. There's Instagram. So it's selected a default app for me. And now I can save it directly to Instagram. I don't think anybody wants to see a picture of my monitor on Instagram. So I'm going to go ahead and back out of that. Let's go back to the app. I do want to show you that you can remotely control it also. So I'll hit exit here and get back to the main screen. After you finish the transfer like that, it's going to give up. So you kind of want to transfer all your pictures all at once. And then I'll have to go back in and wake the camera up by turning it off and back on. Then I'll hit the menu button, camera icon, wireless communication. And so, okay, so now the Wi-Fi in the camera is on again. You might want to set that to a shortcut key or something. I'll connect back here, and I can use remote control here. As you can see, remote control shows me the live view scene. Look, there's my cameraman, Justin. You can touch to focus. So your Fuji finally has a touchscreen on it. You can do things like change the aperture, change the ISO, etc. I'll click OK there. And finally, when you're ready to take a picture, just hit the big red shutter button. If you go to back out of the remote control, you will lose your Wi-Fi connection. So again, you have to go back into the menu, camera, wireless communications, turn that on, resync your phone and camera. You might pick up that I don't think the implementation of the app is as refined as it should be for somebody who regularly uses it. We do travel a lot and we share a lot of images on social media while we're traveling, and an app like this in most camera manufacturers is difficult to use and kind of a nuisance, so I often end up just waiting until I can get back to my laptop and loading it that way. So it does technically work, but it's cumbersome and frustrating and slow. So if you're feeling that way, I am too. And it's not that you don't know how to use it, it's just that it could definitely use some refinement. Fuji has the ability to update the app and the camera through firmware updates. I hope they do that soon. Let's talk about the difference between RAW and JPEG files. RAW files capture all the information from your camera sensor into a file, allowing you to recover shadows and highlights later, allowing you to fix white balance perfectly, that kind of thing. JPEG files take all that information and then compress it down into a smaller, more compact format, but also throw out a lot of that data. By default, your camera is set up to take JPEG files, which is throwing away a lot of useful information. If you never edit your photos, JPEG is fine. If you do edit your photos, the RAW files really do look quite a bit better when you edit them. To switch to shooting RAW files, I'll turn the camera off and back on again to wake it up. I'll hit the menu button here, and then under IQ, image quality, I'll scroll down to image quality here, scroll to the right, and then I'll select RAW. And now you're shooting RAW files. You'll need a image processor that will convert the images for you. I tend to use Adobe Lightroom, and in fact, I have a book on Adobe Lightroom. An app like that will really save you a lot of time. For detailed information about the difference between RAW and JPEG, check this URL here. I'll show you more about why exactly you might want to use RAW files. I'll briefly cover the metering modes. The metering mode is controlled by this dial underneath the shutter speed here. So you can see it has 4 different positions, and I tend to leave it in this 3rd position all the time. And if you don't want to know everything about photography, skip to the next section. Just use that and not worry about it. This one to the left here is spot metering, which will determine the brightness of the entire scene from a very small part of the scene by making that small part medium gray. If you don't know what any of that means, fine, just don't sweat it. If you're an old school film photographer and use spot metering, it's still there. This next option is center weighted metering, which meters from a slightly bigger area. And again, in digital photography, I don't ever worry about that. I just use the default, and then I adjust the exposure compensation as necessary by looking at the scene with my eye. This last option is simply averaged, where it takes the entire scene and kind of blends it all together evenly. Again, this scene works the best. For detailed information about metering modes, check Chapter 3 of Stunning Digital Photography. White balance determines how white, yellow, or blue your picture might be. If you get images in and they look a little yellow, a little blue, or a little green, it's probably a white balance problem. The camera has auto white balance, just like your brain does, and it will kind of figure out the light you're in and try to choose the right white balance setting for that. You can also manually choose your white balance setting. Note that if you shoot RAW and edit your pictures in something like Lightroom, you don't have to worry about this at all. And that's what I do. So I never worry about white balance when I'm shooting. I just fix it later because I just find that easier. And usually when I'm shooting, I have other things that I want to think about, like the lighting and the composition and such. If you want to change it, you can do so with the Q button here. Hit the Q button and then scroll to the right option here, white balance. And now you can scroll between a variety of different options. They've got icons here that pretty much show you what you want. Cloudy day, fluorescent lights, incandescent lights, etc. The K there will allow you to specify the white balance in Kelvin. To choose what the actual Kelvin option is going to be, hit the menu button. Go to IQ, go down to white balance here, and then scroll to the right. And if I scroll to the right again, you can see I can pick the Kelvin. And it's previewing the picture for me. So you can see my monitor there is showing up in different colors. I can kind of pick the one that looks white to my eye. That looks pretty good. And just select that. You can also manually shift the white balance around. So you have infinite control over what your white balance is going to be. But again, for me, I just leave it on auto and I shoot RAW. And that works out really well for me. This camera produces pretty amazing video, and it does full 4K video. It's one of my favorite video cameras to use. To record in video, you're going to change your shutter mode here. So right now it's on bracketing, but it might be in continual low, continual high. move it over to the video camera here. You can see as you switch to video mode, the preview switches to 16:9, just like your TV probably is. And it shows you audio levels over here. These audio levels are from the on-camera mic, but if you have a mic hooked up, it'll be showing you those audio levels. That's pretty useful. To start recording, just press the shutter button and it will start recording. And that's basically all there is to it. By default, it will try to focus. I have it in AFC now, so you can see as I'm changing the scene, it's focusing just quite slowly though. Come on. Okay, there it finally got it. For best results, you're going to want to put it into single focus mode or manual focus mode, and then focus basically ahead of time and lock the focus in and then just kind of leave it there. There are a few settings you should know about for video. I'm going to hit the menu button here and then scroll down to the video camera icon here. Movie mode is the most important. This will control the quality of your video, and by default it's in 1080p 60 frames a second. 1080p 30 frames a second is standard for YouTube. It's also standard for most HD TV in the United States, though, well, either 720 or 1080p at 30 frames a second. So 60 frames a second is twice as many frames per second as normal. That gives you a very smooth motion, especially for action scenes. It feels more realistic and lifelike, and I like it a lot. It also takes up twice as much space, basically, but I like 60 frames a second a lot. If you want sharp images, this video that you're watching is recorded in 4K. Go up to my favorite mode, which is 2160 at 2997. That's 30 frames a second, basically, and select that. You're now going to get very big video files, but 4K video is beautiful, and if you're not sure why we would want to shoot 4K, visit stp.io/y4k, the letter Y, the number 4, and the letter K. And I have a video that will describe it in more detail. You can also change, from the same menu here, you can also change the movie AF mode to go between a single focusing point and area focusing point. Again, I like the multi-point because I want to choose where it's outputting to. And you can output video while you're recording through that micro HDMI port on the side here. By default, it's turned off. Rather, by default, information is turned off. So by default, the camera will output clean HDMI to a field recorder if you're using that. Note that the field recorder is the only way to record F-Log. F-Log is just a logarithmic video standard that allows you to capture more highlights and shadows without kind of throwing away that information. If you're not a serious filmmaker who's going to be using a field recorder, don't even worry about it, because you have to have like an expensive field recorder to be able to capture that with this camera anyway. You can control where the video is output to, whether it's to an SD card, HDMI, or here's the option for F-Log, HDMI F-Log. That's where you would actually turn that on. And if your mics are a little hot or a little low, you can go in and adjust the mics here. So if I turn it way down, you can see my levels are pretty low here, or I can crank it all the way up and suddenly my volume is really high. These levels are all pretty good, and the default should probably be fine for most things. So to get back to regular shooting, you'll switch over to whatever shutter mode you actually want to use. Let's talk about formatting a memory card. Your SD cards in the side here are your virtual film, and no matter how big the card is, eventually you're going to fill it up. You want to make sure you unload those pictures to your computer, then back that up offsite somewhere, like to a cloud service, so you don't lose your pictures. But at that point, you can now format your memory card. And there's a trick that I'll show you. You can do this with the Fuji. What you're going to do is hold the trash can button. Let's turn this off and back on so it again. I'm going to hold the trash can button for a couple of seconds, and then I'm going to push this reel here, and it will pop up giving me the option to format it. Select the SD card you want to format and then select OK. The SD cards are labeled in here if you're not sure which is which, and I'm not ready to format, so I don't want to do that, because if you format, you're going to lose all the data on your memory card. If you forget that keyboard shortcut, you can hit the menu button here, go down to the wrench icon, go to user setting, I don't know why it's there, and then format. That gets you to the same place. If you accidentally format a memory card, or you just want to restore your pictures because your computer crashed and you know you have them on your memory card still, here's a free tool that will help you do that, stp.io/photorec. If you Google photo recovery, you'll find a bunch of people who exploit people who've accidentally formatted their memory cards or their disk drives, or have otherwise lost data, and they'll charge you 50 bucks. But they all kind of use PhotoRec as the underlying tool. So just go to the source, get PhotoRec. It's free. It's for Windows, Mac, Linux, just about anything. And it can be a lifesaver, not just SD cards or memory cards, but also computer hard drives if they happen to fail. Let's talk about how to turn off that awful beep that happens. You know, when it focuses and it beeps a little bit. I turned it off on this camera already. But that beep is so annoying. If you're a wedding photographer, you know, there's always people in the pews who are taking pictures and their cameras beeping, beep, beep. Oh, there it goes. Oh, so maddening. Please just turn that off. It will show green when you've actually focused. So you don't need that sound, and it's annoying to everybody around you. Go to the wrench icon, go down to sound setup, scroll to the right. Go to shutter sound. Oh no, I'm sorry. Go to shutter volume. Turn that off. Also go to AF beep volume and turn that off. Now, you can still leave on the self-timer volume, since you probably won't be using that in a church. And playback volume controls the volume when you're playing back video. And again, they're probably not going to be disturbing people by doing that. So thanks for turning off your beep. Let's talk about back button focus. Back button focus decouples focusing from the shutter button. So normally when you have to press the shutter button, the camera focuses, and then you can take the picture by fully pressing it. That is not always ideal. Imagine you're doing night photography where focusing can be really hit or miss. You might want to get focus and then take 3 or 4 shots to make sure that you get one clear. Well, if you finally got focus and you took one shot, you would then have to refocus each time. I think a better way to do that is to allow you to push the shutter button without refocusing. And an easy way to do that on the Fuji is just to switch over to manual mode. Just switch that to manual mode, manual focus mode. And well, now you could just manually focus. That works just fine. But you can also autofocus by hitting the AFL button there. So you can see I can still move the focusing point around. I can hit the AFL button and it will snap into focus. So using back button focus is as easy as switching to manual focus mode. To permanently disable focusing from the shutter button and have a very traditional DSLR back button focus experience, I'll hit the menu button, go to the wrench icon, button, dial setting, then scroll down to shutter AF, and I'm going to turn that off. Notice that shutter AE is still on, that shutter auto exposure, so it will still start up the auto exposure system when you have to press a shutter, but it will not start up the autofocus system. So now if I push the shutter button, it won't autofocus for me. That's a good start. We need to tell one of these buttons to be the AF on button. So to do that, I'll scroll up to FN, AEL, AFL button setting, and I'll scroll right here. And then I'll scroll down to the AFL button. And by default, it's set to AF lock, which works fine when you're in manual focus mode, but you might want it to be set to AF on. AF on will continually autofocus even when you're in continuous mode rather than just locking focus. Now, for the way I use the camera, I will sometimes accidentally hit the wrong button, and I don't need the 2 separate buttons to do different things, so I set them both to AF on. So now I can hit either button, and you can see it will snap into focus for me. This works whether I'm in single mode or continuous focus mode, which makes it great for sports. For detailed information about why you might want back button focus, visit this URL here, stp.io/YBB. I just customized a couple of buttons. I'm going to show you again how to customize buttons. I'll hit the menu button here, go to the wrench icon, and then select button dial settings. And here you can see a variety of options for customizing just about every aspect of the physical camera. This is terribly useful because once you figure out the settings that you change regularly, you might want to assign them to like this function button on the top here. That's, by the way, awful placement for the function button. Like it's kind of hard to get to. But by default, that function button up there is good for turning on or off face detection. If you don't ever do that, you could change it to do something else. There's a variety of options there. I'll just let you explore that on your own. Just know that just about every aspect of the camera can be customized. My menu is terribly useful because digging through those menus for the few settings that you change on a regular basis is a real pain. I always forget where they are and I get frustrated about it. Don't be frustrated. Just go in and make your own custom menu that has only the items you need. I'll hit the menu button here. I'll go to the wrench icon. I'll go to user setting, and then I'll select my menu setting. And my menu by default has no items in it. So what you're going to do now is select add items and then put the menu items that you use on a regular basis in here. So I know for me, I shoot RAW most of the time, but if I'm shooting sports, I will switch to JPEG. So I do want image quality in there, and you can see I selected it. There's a checkbox there. So scroll through this list and find the things that you turn on or off on a regular basis. You can scroll to the left here to go through all the different menus. I often change the focusing area. So now that one is selected. You have to hit the OK button when you scroll to the right to get it. So you get the idea. Once you've added some items, you can rank items to change the order of them, move them around like that. And then when you're ready to get to it, when you're actually ready to use it, hit the menu button, scroll all the way down to the bottom where you see My here. And now you can see those 2 menu items that I just added, conveniently not buried in a huge nest of menu items. I've mentioned it a couple of times, but you'll need some software to process your images. I like to use Adobe Lightroom. Maybe some new software will come out in the future, but for now, that's what I'm using. The best deal is to get the Creative Cloud subscription, which is $10 a month and includes Photoshop. Go to sdp.io/Adobe deal to get that. And also, we have books on Photoshop and Lightroom, both of which include over 12 hours of video. Terribly useful if you're trying to learn it. Batteries, you will need extra batteries. You can use our link here, and it helps to support us and support us making these free videos. The battery will not last all day in a busy day of shooting. I tend to travel with 3 batteries, but I usually only need 2 on a given day. The third one is just for safety. Some people prefer to have actually 4 batteries with them. Make sure you get the actual Fuji batteries, or at least I recommend getting the actual Fuji batteries. You'll find knockoff generic batteries for a much lower price, but my experience with those is that they work great for 6 weeks, maybe a couple of months, and then they die suddenly. And the last thing you want when the sun comes out and the light is perfect is for your battery to just suddenly die without any kind of warning. That's impossibly frustrating. Get the real batteries. Another kind of must-have accessory for the X-T2 is the battery grip. And this is the battery grip. And what you'll do is you'll take off the cap here, and you'll take off this from the bottom, and this will allow you to attach the battery grip. It just screws right onto the tripod mount. And the battery grip does a few things. First, it gives you 3 batteries because you leave the battery in the body there. And then you can twist this to pop out and reveal the other 2 batteries. So your battery life will essentially be 3 times longer. It also gives you access to higher frame rates when you're using the mechanical shutter. It won't make really any difference if you're using the electronic shutter. It gives you this physical switch between normal and boost mode. You pretty much always leave it in boost mode. It also allows you to hold the camera vertically, which is easier when you're shooting in kind of portrait vertical format than having to twist your arm like this. I don't mind twisting my arm like that. It makes the camera much heavier. Notice that there's a lock and unlock button here, so if you're going to use it, you'll want to use this shutter button. You'll want to unlock it. The reason it locks is you might set the camera down and push that button in, and then you're shooting 14 frames a second until you pick the camera up. That would be bad. So you'll usually leave that locked. I like and dislike the vertical grip. With the vertical grip and with it in boost mode and with the batteries all fully charged or mostly charged, it will overall improve the performance of the camera. The viewfinder will be faster and just generally look better too. I will always use it for sports because I like the extra performance when I'm shooting sports. But in my day-to-day shooting, if I'm traveling with it, I do not like the extra bulk and the extra weight. One of the things I like about the X-T2 is that it's lightweight. I don't actually think it's a must-have for most photographers because even without the vertical grip, the X-T2 does a really good job of just general shooting, and you really don't need any extra help when you're focusing. So It's fine without it. But the vertical grip adds a little extra power, a little faster speed, extra batteries, and it also adds the headphone jack here, which is terribly, terribly useful. It also comes with an AC charger, or rather a DC charger, so that you can plug it into the wall and charge up the 2 batteries in here. It's charging 2 batteries simultaneously, which, especially when you travel, if you bring one single battery charger, it's a pain to make sure that 3 or 4 batteries are all charged. So the fact that it charges 2 simultaneously makes life a little bit easier. If you have it attached to the camera, it will not charge the 3rd battery in the camera. You will need memory cards, and possibly lots of them, especially if you're shooting some 4K video. We have good experience with even inexpensive memory cards, but the faster memory cards are going to be better for action. If you're taking a lot of shots at 14 frames a second, you can fill up the camera's buffer, and then it will take a long time to write to the cards. So if you're shooting action, you might want a fast memory card. I probably wouldn't buy anything less than a 128 gig card, but I like to have a huge card because I hate running out of space. What's worse than running out of space? Let's talk about the lenses and accessories you can get with it. The kit lens is okay, but the kit lens is not especially sharp. It's still good for video because it's image stabilized. This lens, the 16-55 f2.8, is outrageously sharp. It's like professional grade sharp, but it's not image stabilized. So it's maybe not as good of a walking around lens. It's just better if you want to get great quality images. So for me, it's my kind of walking around lens. It also gives you that clickable aperture ring here with actual number markings on it. If you want that, it's expensive, but you can pick it up at this link here and it helps to support us. I do highly recommend that. If you want to shoot ultra wide, maybe you're shooting in streets in Europe where the streets are crowded, or you're shooting in some beautiful place like Glacier National Park in Montana where you need to be able to shoot really wide, check out the 10 to 24 millimeter f4 lens at this link here, sdp.io/f10. It is not an absolute necessity. You can get by shooting panoramas for most landscape work. I show you how to shoot a panorama in chapter 3 of my book, Stunning Digital Photography. So check that out. Maybe you can get by without having to carry and buy an extra lens. There are a couple of great portrait lenses in the Fuji lineup. My favorite is the outrageously sharp and expensive 50-140 f2.8. This is also my suggestion for sports. Now, this lens is sharper than the Canon and Nikon lenses, just generally produces better results. Even with a lower megapixel body like this, it's a stellar lens, and it has image stabilization, which is great. When you're hand holding, it'll help ensure that your results are nice and sharp. I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite lenses of all time. If you want something that's not so bulky, check out the 56mm f1.2. It's a portrait lens. It will let you blur the background spectacularly, and it's lighter and smaller. It's also pretty expensive, but it's outrageously sharp as well. It's a prime lens, so you can't zoom it in and out. And for me, when I shoot portraits, I really like to have that zoom because that's just the way I shoot. I switch between a headshot to a full body shot, just depending on the pose and the lighting and the mood and that kind of thing. Especially for shooting weddings, I find a zoom to be kind of a must-have. But if you're a primes person, this 56mm is really spectacular. If you're shooting sports and you find that you need a little more reach than you get out of the 50-140, Fuji has 1.4x, 1.4 times, and 2 times teleconverters. The 1.4 times teleconverter takes your focal length and multiplies it times 1.4. It also multiplies your aperture by 1.4. So instead of having a 50-140 lens, you'll have 50 times 1.4. What is that? 70mm to around 200mm f4 lens, somewhere in there. And the 2 times teleconverter will just double everything. So it'll become 100mm to 280mm f5.6. It will reduce the sharpness. It will also reduce things like your focusing speed and make your camera use either a slower shutter speed or a higher ISO. There are disadvantages to the teleconverters, but generally you can crop, especially with that lens, and still get sharp results. For a walking around lens, if you want something really compact, when you put this lens on, the camera's not so small anymore. I really like this pancake lens. It's Fuji's 27mm f2.8. You can get it in silver or black. I have it in silver because it matches my X-T2. And you can see now the camera is really small and light. It's a prime lens, but it's kind of ideal, I find, for things like street photography and just generally casual shooting. Check it out at sdp.io/f27. If you're shooting wildlife or longer range sports, I highly suggest the 100 to 400 f/5.6 lens from Fuji. It's got the extra reach that you need. If you are shooting video, everybody always asks me what mic I'm using. I'm using the Sennheiser EW100 G3s. Check them out at this link. They're a wireless lav, and that's going to get you vastly better sound for any sort of talking head situation like this. If you want to save a few bucks, see if you can go to eBay and find an old EW100 G2 version. There's also an EW100 G4, but the G3s are generally a better value. If you're in the US and you're making prints, Chelsea and I did a whole comparison of different print services in the US. Check it out at this link, sdp.io/printit. We like MPix. Save you some time, use MPix. I don't have a relationship with them except as a customer. I just like them. If you're looking for an inexpensive tripod, something to start out with, I recommend this Dolica tripod. It's only 50 bucks, small and lightweight, and it's pretty good. It's not the best tripod in the world. I like it. If you want something higher quality, check out this Manfrotto tripod. I really like this tripod. Here's a link to it here, sdp.io/mk190. It's a good all-round tripod. It's not the smallest travel tripod in the world, but it's just a good, versatile tripod. And the best investment you can make is in your own education. I've taught you how to use the buttons and dials, and I hope that's helpful. But really, photography is more about the lighting and the mood and the expression and the timing and the planning, the composition. Those are the things that are going to make amazing photos, not how good your camera is or how good you are at finding the settings and the menus. Stunning Digital Photography will teach you how to master all of that. Check it out. The ebook is 10 bucks and includes 14 hours of video, access to a Facebook group where you get lots of peer support, quizzes, practices, everything you need to become a great photographer. We also have books on Lightroom, Photoshop, and our photography buying guide, which tells you all about different lenses and flashes and studio lighting and all that sort of thing that you might buy. Go to Amazon, search for Tony Northrup, or search for the title of the books, or go to sdp.io/store. We ship with worldwide shipping. Thanks so much. Share this with your friends. Give me a like if it was helpful to you. And if you have any further comments, questions, or if you have a suggestion for how you use your X-T2 differently, something that might help other people, add a comment down below. Thanks so much.